I'm going to talk about the little ones of God in a wider context, in a context that I've often used. But I'm going to begin with two little comments, one of which is something I wrote myself in an article that you'll find in the Downside Review about the contemporary challenges to Eastern Catholics in Europe, and it's just this little sentence. In times of uncertainty, the spiritual voice is needed more than ever, and that voice does not require great institutional backing, possessions or numbers. It is a call to encounter, engagement and envisaging. And I've thought about this quite a bit, because the more I think about where we are in the world, and we have to always keep ourselves within the context of the greater world, I'm aware that the Eastern Catholic churches in particular, apart from the Maronites, are not that numerous in terms of world Christianity. But they do pack a punch. And I think it's possibly because they are smaller and have had the capacity to take on the oddballs of theology and ecclesiology and use these characters to speak. I mean, in my own present church, Stephanie has done some work on Massignon, you've got Jean Corbon, you've got a lot of people who came from other countries to join this Middle Eastern church and have become great exponents and great visionaries. Within the church itself, as I'll mention later on, there are some extraordinary characters. One of my favourites is the patriarch who opposed the infallibility decree of Vatican I. Quite strenuously. He was very punished for it. I mean, he had some humiliating encounters with the Pope, including having to go down on the floor and the Pope putting his foot on his head as a kind of submission. I mean, that's the old-fashioned type of imperial activity. But there's a valid point there. Second quotation I want to use is something I found in that wonderful world of Twitter and tweet and everywhere else. And it was a dialogue between some, what I call in Oxford, we'd call them the brideshead Catholic boys, who sort of go around dressed up looking like brideshead prophets, and who are very conservative in their attitude towards liturgy and towards doctrine, but haven't got any theological backing. And it went something like this. What is a Melkite Catholic? Surely if they are Catholic, they have to take on board everything that the Roman Catholic Church teaches. Who is this person? It wasn't me, I might say, who is commenting about, and it was the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Surely they should be told that everything that they accept has to be exactly the same as the Roman Catholic Church, full stop. And then there comes a bat and ball tweet. Nobody, I might add, in any of this says anything about the documents of the Second Vatican Council, or even of a basic understanding of ecclesiology. That the churches that are not Latin are actually churches sui juris, with their own law, with their own pattern of behaviour. That doesn't come into it. And nor do they actually look at the dialogues that have been going on between the churches over what it might mean to actually be Catholic, or what it might mean to be someone who has a veneration for the Theotokos, or has the triple understanding of the three orders in that sacramental sense of bishop, priest, deacon. What does that mean for the church? Not a bit of it. So I looked at that and I thought, I better step back, otherwise my temper, as I get older, I tend to be a bit more feisty about replying. I might have pinged something off very quickly and find that I started a kind of outrageous series of comments all over Oxford. So I didn't do that. But it actually causes me to ask myself a question. What is going on now in a church outside where so little is known, apart from people like ourselves, of Eastern churches? There are groups. There's the Fellowship of St. Alban and Sergius. There's the particular groups where we actually engage with the Orthodox, the Oriental Orthodox, Byzantine Orthodox, whatever was going on. There are key people that we know. Archbishop Angelos, I won't say any more about that, is somebody we see on television and keeps coming out with press releases about the Coptic Church. he's collared a market there. But where are the rest? In the 1920s, 30s, 40s in this country, there was a huge interest in the Eastern churches going on, perhaps because of the whole communist ideology in the Slav countries, particularly Russia, and the emigre community, and this fascination with a persecuted church that was holding on to its teaching. But where is that today? So I look at myself and I look at what's going on and say, there is bad ecclesiology floating round. There is appalling ecumenism, misguided in some senses, and there is what I call a tendency at the moment among some who are not very intellectually bound to a colonial, what I call imperium. And I see that, alas, in the way that certain groups are taking the high moral ground and actually trying to impose their Christian worldview on other communities. Now, this is pushing the boundaries quite somewhat, but I quite enjoy going in dialogue. And I think we need to be in dialogue because we need to be aware of what's happening in our world. We're not in the second millennium, we're not in the first millennium, we're in the third. And we're at the beginning of the third, and so new challenges are emerging to the churches in the world of today. If we go around the room and I say, where is the growth of the church of Christ in the world? Well, it appears not to be in Europe, although I would challenge that. I think there is sign of growth, but not where you'd expect. It's more in the formation of new communities. It's actually something to do with Pentecostal groups or millennial groups that meet and are starting to create new type of community under the surface of the official churches, but they're there. There's also a resurgence, very gentle, but it's starting, of what I call community life, religious life in different formats, where they often have married groups or other partnership groups with those who are the celibate communities. Something's going on there, I think. There's a hopeful sign there. There's also a deep sense of wanting to find spirituality. And so I think the ecumenism of the churches, particularly my own, is focused very much on how do we engage in the sense of being small. And I look to the history of the church and I think it is by the characters who emerge out and who are not unafraid to voice what they feel is important. Whether they're right or whether they're wrong, that's for history to decide. And again, it's like the gospel, isn't it? I keep thinking of the parable of the sower. We sow the seed, as the sower does, but we're not going to harvest. We're harvesting other people's sowing, but we are not going to harvest our own sowing. And that's part of the trust of faith, that you have to put your trust in the Lord of the harvest, who is there with us, calling us. So, beginning this little comment about ecumenism, ecclesiology, about my own church and about the engagement with the world, what do we have to do? Well, we can't go back to the past, and that's a problem. There is a tendency. There used to be a cartoon book done by a monk of Downside called Dom Hubert van Zeller, which was a cartoon of a monk called Brother Choleric, sort of angry monk. And the cartoons were all about monastic life, and it was just at the time when the Second Vatican Council was emerging in the Catholic Church, and Hubert van Zeller was not in favour of this. So he used to do these punchy little cartoons, and one of the series was about what not to do. You know, we shouldn't do this and we shouldn't do that. And part of this is, I think, we can't go back to the past. And part of his vision was that's where we should go back because that was where everything is safe. But that isn't safety. The past is another country. And you all know that. You know it instinctively. And you know what happens if you dwell too much in the past. You just become an echo of something else. So I feel that the tradition of the church, that wonderful theology of tradition, is the tradition of handing on, exactly what it means. When we talk about tradition, we're talking about handing on something that is at the core wonderfully connected, but has to be interpreted and lived out wherever we are and whatever we're doing. And I think one of the genius of the sort of Eastern churches in particular strands has been the idea that there are certain things that are not immutable. For instance, the Melkite Church had a huge influence, of which I'm tremendously proud, on the Latin Church at the Second Vatican Council, particularly in the use of vernacular in scriptures and in liturgy. Now, whether you like Latin and don't like the lingua franca, I don't mind. But what they were saying is, the basic question, and it was the Patriarch Maximus IV asked it, is there a sacred language for Christianity? The answer is no. Pentecost tells you that. The apostles in that statement of the Acts, here in various linguas, in many languages, the gospel proclaimed. And that was, in a sense, what he was trying to say. He was trying to say the church can have a language, but if that language in a culture no longer operates, no longer is able to dialogue, we have a problem. Now, I'm not talking about other churches that do have liturgical language that are well known, the Copts, for instance, the Armenians. We have the Slav cultures. I'm talking about a pastoral connection in the world of the third millennium. Will people learn the languages of the liturgy? Probably they will, and people seem to like the languages of the liturgy. But in the ordinary engagement, we have to learn a new language of how to traditio, the teachings and understandings of the church, so that people can accept them. It's all about the question Jesus asks, who am I? And we have to say, I am he, you are he. The world of the people of God is he. And therefore, how do we connect at the heart of it? The second thing is that we can, if we like, just say, let's become Fortress Church. That's been a thing that's been floated around. And we can just actually have a corporate takeover. That's not a good model. I don't think a business model is ever good for a church, because it starts to operate, unless it has something underneath it, in a particular way that then suggests success is equated to X. Now, you and I know that the biggest success stories of the church are always equated to Y, the death of Christ, the martyrs, the failures out of which new things are born. The whole language of the church is actually very countercultural. And I think that's something that the Eastern churches have and can give to a world that wants success stories. And one of the things that's come out of the Middle East, and I think Pope Francis articulated it so very well, is this phrase, the ecumenism of martyrdom. The fact that when you are under extreme pressure, when your whole fabric is gone, you have to get on with people of the faith. You can't afford to spend time in the luxury of saying, I'm a Melkite Catholic, you're a Maronite, we don't really speak because you're different. You have to get on together. It's the same with the evangelical Christians and the Latins and whoever they may be. One has to get on. You cannot witness to Christ if you're fragmented at the point of where your own martyrdom is taking place. The great thing about the martyrs, and you go right the way back to the early church, is that they witnessed to Christ. They didn't witness to the church. They were members of the church, but their witness was to him. It is he they witnessed to. So I think that we're also being called back to renew our own understanding of the suffering Christ, but the Christ that the East always points to in its liturgy, in its theology, the Christ of the Spirit who is risen. It's not for nothing that the theology of the Holy Spirit is so implicit in Eastern theology all the way through. So that's the second point. We don't and can't and shouldn't just become an enclosed community. We have to realize that we are a pilgrim church as well. And I'm using the church as the Church of Christ. So what do I suggest in my own comments about ecumenism and the little ones of God is that we look at the little ones of God, particularly in Scripture, and we look at ourselves, we look at our Middle Eastern churches, we look at who we are, And we say, these are the poor churches of the world. They're poor because they do not have power. They do not have fabric. Their voices are often muted, but they have a spiritual dynamism which is often more powerful than they know, because it's rooted in the humility of those who have had nearly everything taken away from them. And I think that's an important spiritual insight, that the world of the third millennium has begun with a complete and utter change for the Christian pattern of life. The European communities are beginning to realize that no longer is certain section of Christianity European. You have a sort of echoes of it still maybe in the Americas, where bishops and others are sort of still powerful people, but that's going. And it's going despite what they like to think. One of the things I think that has been really insightful in the whole progress of Pope Francis has been a radical, if you like, burrowing down into the church and saying, you might have all these good things, but there are bad things and they need to be brought out. I mean, the whole thing of abuse, horrible though it may be, is actually a call to repentance and contrition on the part of the whole church. And I, for one, feel that actually now the bishops have been brought into it can only be a good thing, because it means that as a collective whole, pastors and people, we have to accept responsibility and also recognize that we are a sinful people in need of forgiveness and repentance, but that can happen. And empty gestures don't apply here. I think the gestures of the Pope, the fact that a Pope could actually say, as this one has done, I was wrong, is a huge breakthrough in what I would call the old imperial power of the church, where it used to be, I am right, even if you think I'm wrong. That is what I call true obedience, because it means people are listening deeply to God calling them. And obedience is about that word, the rule of St. Benedict, ausculta, to listen with the heart and discern with others what God is calling us to do. And it may not be what we think we ought to. So I think the third millennium is, first of all, an exciting time. I'm sorry I'm not going to see beyond perhaps the first 50 years of it. I mean, I'm well aware of my own age. I'm well aware that the doors of heaven, or somewhere else, are not too far off. So I'm aware that one is on one's own journey, but I hope and pray that what we do, especially in work like this, will inspire young women and young men, both from our own Middle Eastern communities and our communities in the countries we belong to engage at a real level with the needs of people and the needs of the church itself, and to witness to diaconia, to service of others. And I think that's one of the hallmarks always I've discovered in the Eastern Church. And I think that's one of the things I've found about the relationship, particularly in my own church, between bishop and people. It's not the powerful bishop who has bureaucracy, big diocese, big cathedral, lots and lots of people to help him. Our bishops don't have that luxury, which is good. And whenever I've met them, they've been very, very close to people and actually have to listen to people, including people being cross and angry with them. And that can only be a good thing, because it means that priest and people are connected in a way that they need to be. And it also gives one an insight into humility. There's nothing so good as one of your parishioners telling you off, or, as we have in my own parish, arguing in the middle of a sermon. I say this with duplicity here, because my own sermons they don't argue with, but they do argue with Abuna Shafiq, which I'm delighted at. They sort of say, Father Robert doesn't say this, but you do, this is terrible. So he always says to me, what have you just said last week? And I say, you'll have to find out, but it wasn't what you were saying this week. But their dialogue is about taking them on, walking with them, helping them. And I think this ecumenical activity is also important as well. And I come here to climate change within our own country. So I'm going to just move slightly from that, which I've been saying, to look at a particular instance. I think of the visit of Prince Charles to our parish in December. It was a moment of great interest because on many levels it changed patterns of perception. For me, I think I saw an insight into the Prince that I wouldn't have guessed I'd have seen. And that is that for a long time people have been aware, as you know, that he's had quite a wide-ranging interest in religions. But suddenly, over the past decade or so, he has focused very much on the Eastern communities as well, and is very passionate in his own way about the Middle Eastern churches. And I think, as he said in his own little speech to everybody present, he was really upset and quite appalled at what was happening in the Middle East and the potential extinction, that wasn't his word, that's mine, of the Christian community. Now, you could say that's just good PR and they've done their homework and they've given him all the things they need to know about the Melkite Church and other churches in the Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt. But I think it was more than that, because I did detect from him a shift that I'd noted much earlier in other engagements when we met with him, that we didn't have this diversity of faith. We had a concerted interest in Christianity. So his own perception has shifted to looking at Christianity, and I think that can only be good, because in order to dialogue with others, we have to be sure of where we are. Metropolitan Anthony Bloom used to say that often. You cannot be ecumenical unless your roots are solid in your own tradition. Then you can bend towards others, knowing that your roots are deep in the place you've come from. And I think that's the same sort of thing that the Prince may be beginning to understand. And one of the other things is his real friendship with different Eastern people. I know that Archbishop Angelos is kind of seen as a kind of Prince of Wales fan. But I have to say that our own bishop, Bishop Issam Darwish of Zakhle, who used to be the Melkite Archbishop in Australia, so therefore is very well known in English-speaking world, is actually a very personal friend of his, which I didn't know. And then we found out this is partly why he came to the parish, because he came over, Aid to the Church in Need had helped him come over, and he'd gone off to see his friend the Prince of Wales, and then said, come to our parish. Come to our parish. It's a small little church. It's not on the great sort of gong of the higher churches. It's a small, tiny church. It's a little church. And I think that was a wonderful gift, in a sense, which we need to capitalize on in terms of reflection and writing, and the challenge that was there when he appeared. And I have to say, he was exceptionally good with the people. He spent far more time than was allotted to him talking to them. And I'm very grateful to say he came up and complimented me on my singing, but said, but I do know you from last time. So I thought, oh, well, he remembers. And it wasn't the fact that he hadn't remembered, because he had remembered this. The problem is, of course, that I don't know how one can build on that goodwill. I think it is often on personal relationships. So perhaps the key of ecumenism, the key of ecclesiology, is not so much doctrine, it's the goodwill and friendship of individuals with each other. Far more is said in the symbol of friendship than in common agreements signed, which are then, alas, quite often, put on one side and forgotten until the next time that they're talked about. But I think also, when I thought of Prince Charles coming to us and the Archbishop speaking to him, they spoke from the heart, which was important, so that the people resonated. Talked about what people were suffering, but he also talked about the reality of the people in this country, because our Middle Eastern parish may have some refugees, but not very many. We haven't seen any Syrian Christian refugees. As we were hearing yesterday, where are they? Where are the Christians? They haven't come in on the sort of trail of the refugees for various reasons, some of them not very good reasons. I don't mean because of the Christians, but the way that they've been treated. The other thing is that there is this push, I think, from the church, certainly ours and others over in Lebanon and Syria, to get back the key people who disappeared, the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, and alas, I'm ashamed to say, some of the clergy who kind of abandoned their flock and disappeared and have now been called back. There is that task. And I have to say that repeatedly during the whole of the conflict that's been going on, patriarchs and bishops have said, you clergy must stay with your people. And that's important. It's important for the future. And there are initiatives going on which we never hear about, the small little initiatives that are going to change things greatly. My old patriarch, Gregorius III, is, I think, one of these prophetic figures. This is where I move now. He, in a sense, scandalized a lot of people when he came over here once by saying that the Melkite Church was definitely a church for Islam. And people didn't know what he meant. What he meant was the Melkite community, the Church of Antioch, was there when the whole of the initial stages of Islam began, and were instrumental in translating texts to people who were mainly Bedouin, were instrumental in giving them intellectual support, were instrumental in helping the dimensions of early Islam move. And there's a lot of hidden textual thought in many early Islamic literature. And that needs to be recognized. And if only, as the patriarch had seen, if only people could get out of this terrible conflict of seeing Daesh as one thing and look at Islam at another stage of history, we might find ways of beginning to talk. Because a lot of people over here, especially many of our Islamic community, haven't a clue of the origins of their history itself, of the life of the Prophet, of what went on in the early days, of the veneration that is there in text and in practice to saints beloved by Christians and Muslims alike. These things need more concurrence, need more listening, need more work. And the problem is, of course, that we have, alas, at the moment, global powers which are working against this kind of dialogue. Everything has to fit into a narrow soundbite box, usually negative. I won't say anything about particular world leaders, although I would have much to say about one if I could. But there was a Guardian article only 2 days ago which mentioned the American president in terms of, slightly jokingly, but it was there, that wasn't what was going on in his mind and his task, didn't have echoes of what they're trying to do with the renewal of the caliphate, ? I mean, it was an interesting article, because suddenly you thought, my goodness, they're utilizing the Bible, Sessions particularly, in ways that it shouldn't be used. But where's the voice saying, stop that? You know, take that text away from them again. This is where I think that the martyrdom, if you like, of the Eastern Church is important, because they have been through so much and they can give us so much, but they need to also help us find the truth, because at the moment the truth is very vague in all sorts of areas. And I think too, people like Gregorius saying we are a church for Islam was saying something important. We are not there to convert Islam. We are there to live alongside it and respect it. I've always remembered him talking to us again, and I think he is one of the people that in the future I would see as a great man of the little ones of the church, where he talked about going on the feast of Eid, as they do, the religious leaders, to the great mosque in Damascus, to meet the mufti and the imam, to give them greetings on the feast at the end of the great fast. And he went with his counterpart, the Greek Orthodox Antiochian Patriarch, and himself, and I think the Chaldean and several others, and they go as they do in their outfits, take their shoes off, they put on slippers, and they go into the mosque where they present very formally greetings. And then on that occasion, they were asked to address the faithful who had gathered for the sermon. So before the official sermon, the Orthodox patriarchs and the Melkite patriarch shared greetings and they prayed. And he always says, "I do pray." And one member of the audience at that point said, "Do you use Christian terminology?" And he said, "Am I foolish enough to provoke things? No, but I will use the one God, who for us is three in one." And so he used the blessing that we have in the liturgy, which is just the simple blessing of "Blessed is God at all times now and unto the ages of ages." And that was his blessing for the community, but it was a Christian liturgical blessing. And he said, and nobody there complained. This is part of, I think, the bravery of people who have a vision and an insight. It's going to cause them trouble, and it caused him trouble. He also said that we are a church that is the Arab church in particular. And what he was also saying there is that before Islam, Arab was. And that therefore is important. I'd taken that on board, but I hadn't taken it on board to the extent that he talks about. Mind you, I have to be careful. There are members of our own parish. I mean, if you talk about the Lebanese, they would be horrified if you started talking about them in quite that term. So one has to distinguish between the different cultures. But the patriarch was making a point. And he was making a point about the energy, the divine energy that is there in the smallest things of life, that you don't have to be a large monolithic group to actually have the voice of praise across the world. And this is what I mean about the little ones of God, that these small churches have a value and have a sense. Even in the dying echoes, their voice is important. I mean, just think to yourself, Anne Frank's diaries, everybody, young people know what they're about. There are many others that are people who disappeared, concentration camps, just were annihilated, were martyred, whose voices centuries on are still important. It doesn't matter how big you are, it matters about the truth and the vision that you have and share. And people hear that like a clarion call, like a bell. So I think of Gregorius, our last patriarch. I don't really know our new one. He's a gentle soul, so I've no doubt he has his own ministry. But I think also of people in my own parish. Our deacon, Richard, who is an excitable character, exercises quite an interesting ministry of communication by letter and by email, with all sorts of people to bring out and share with people the idea of the theology of the East and what it means and what this is. It's not about special behaviour, it's about being faithful to a vision and to a church that has in its sense, at the heart of what it means, liturgy and spirituality, and that's where we're rooted. I think of Elias Zogby, many of you will know about him, whose wonderful vision of union put forward in the 1995 exchange between the Antiochian Orthodox and the Melkite Greek Catholics produced a document of almost near reunion, then stamped on, but it's there. And it's a way of looking to see how one can break down barriers and move into unity. And I think one of the other things that I have to say at this point, and I'm going to sort of draw to a close in a moment, is the sadness that ecumenism has kind of lost its impetus and it needs to be recovered. And so I think also that many of the churches of the Middle East have among them people who are peoples of encounter, because I think ecumenism at heart is about encountering the other and finding the other to be sister or brother rather than someone who is a stranger. And at the heart of it, what unites us is more important, isn't it? That's the phrase often used, but it is true. What's important needs to be brought out. This is his sort of statement, two-sentence statement. I believe everything which Eastern Orthodoxy teaches. I am in communion with the Bishop of Rome as the first among the bishops, according to the limits recognised by the Holy Fathers of the East during the first millennium before the separation. I think that was the bit that stuck in the craw. But it actually is a very effective statement, and a lot of Melkites who tend towards the East love this greatly. And I hope that it might be possible that reunion, at least among one or two of the churches, might be possible. For the Melkites, reunion is not a possibility, it's an absolute. We're not schismatic churches. The breakup of the Melkite church took place because of two patriarchal elections, not dogma or doctrine. And it was a late break. And it's therefore not about sister churches, it's about one family that has been split and needs to get back together again. A bit different from the situations you find with the Ukrainians and others, but it is something I feel strongly about. What else have we got? I think one of the things I would like to sort of end up with on this is that there's always an importance in the value, as I mentioned earlier on, of religious community life. I think that ecumenism has to take place in settings. You need to have the space to come together. There is the coming together of people in parishes. We have in our parish, for instance, to give you an example, on any one Sunday, yes, a lot of Lebanese, a lot of Syrian, we've got Sudanese, but we also have Croatians, we have Ukrainians, we have a lot of British who are married in and have become converts because they came from nothing. I must have baptized myself. A number of British-born people who had no faith background at all because they had been in that culture that this country had of disconnection with either the Anglican Church or other churches over 2 generations. So they weren't baptized. They didn't know faith. So when they came to marry somebody whose faith was about the whole of their life, not just going to church, they became interested. So they came, they come, and they often ask to be baptized and chrismated before they get married, which saves a lot of problems in terms of paperwork. But it also is a wonderful way to bring them in. But I keep saying to myself, I'm only going to be around for so long. How do we integrate them in? Because this is a different category. This is not Middle Eastern people. These are people from another culture who've come to the church. What is it that they find similar with our Middle Eastern community? What is it? And I think it's the liturgy. I think it's the friendship. I think it's the fact there's a spirituality that is at the heart of life. That what you do in Lent is not just in church, that the fasting is important for your life outside, that your prayer is also something that you love at home. The veneration of the holy icons is not something we do in church, but our prayer space in the place where we live. That the feast days somehow are brought into our life as well. The fact that we have to make space to celebrate the feasts is important, that we have to spend effort in doing something ourselves means that it's valuable, that we're working at being Christian. The Prince of Wales himself said that in this troubled time when many Christians face such desperate trials, there is at least some potential comfort to be found by remembering our connections to the earliest days of the church. And I think perhaps that's something to do with that wonderful German word Heimat. I can't remember the Welsh word for it, but going home to me seems tremendously important in this day and age. I know that the scriptures will tell us our true home is in heaven, but we're not there, and the kingdom of God is still around us here as we journey towards it. But there is a yearning in the exile of our communities for home. But our true home is with Christ. And I think the Prince's words are tremendously important, that we need to know the early days of our community. We need to know these Middle Eastern and other Eastern churches who have kept the faith in huge and difficult times, and to know why they've kept it and how they've kept it. in order that we can respond to their need and to look forward to the future. I mean, it's tremendously important that we do that. Are there problems? Well, as a British-born Melkite priest now, I think there are loads. But I am now in this sort of stage of my harvesting. Someone put me down the other days and said, "You're not young anymore. You're in the season of the harvest and it's coming to the end." And I thought, no, it isn't. I've got a few more years yet. But I know what they meant. And I thought, yeah, the harvest is long. This is the season of harvesting. And I think the season of harvesting is also that we recover things that we ourselves perhaps have neglected. And for me, my Benedictine training and my Benedictine love has come back again in a real way. And I've suddenly thought, yes, the monastic community, the community of people engaged together, praying together, working, sharing, allowing diversity of gifts, but recognizing the unity in our faith and origins, is the way we need to hold on to what we have. My great sadness is that we haven't got over here the communities of Benedictines that they have in other parts of the world, who became centres of dialogue and encounter, and need to get back to that. Chefton is one, where some of my community went for a while. I also claim a kind of spiritual lineage with Archimandrite Lev, who was a monk of Farnborough where I was, and who I met several times in the graveyard, a very good place to meet, where you look at eternity and the life of your brethren. And that's what he used to say. I've come here to say hello to my old friends who lie in the peace of God. And that's where I first met him, when I was a young novice tidying up the graveyard. And there he came and sat down on the bench. So I got out of manual work for a good hour or so, sitting talking to him. But he really gave me an impetus and an insight into the love of the East. And it also reminded me that the Orthodox tradition has a deep monastic root. And that is about countercultural ascesis and a spiritual tradition that is not the primary tradition that we're hearing in the world. It's about humility. It's about obedience to the voice of God discerned among ourselves. It's about prayer. It's about putting the other and Christ first. It's about the poverty of life so that we share with others. It's about care. Where charity and God is, and where charity and love is, there is God, says the Latin rite in its washing of feet on Maundy Thursday. And that is true. So I'm going to end by saying that I haven't talked too much about little ones, but I've given you names of little ones that I think, from my own tradition, have been important people. And I know Stephanie will mention someone later on today who is important. But those are voices from the past. We need to become ourselves the voices of the present, and we need to help others become voices of the future. We need to be the good news, not the fake news. And we need to be a people whose understanding of our Christian roots is challenged by our Middle Eastern churches. And we need to help them, very much help them in the diaspora communities where they face all sorts of things they never would have expected. Think of this country and its laws and pluralities. It's no good to attack things. You've got to learn to discern and understand what's going on. But also, I think it's about being true and truthful. Maybe I can just end on this quote that I wrote, and it's coming out in the yearbook for Living Stones. Is there a future for the Living Stones of the Middle East? Do they seek life and freedom? May they, in an uncertain future, move from their own lands to the diaspora? What then will happen to the source of Christianity in its historical setting? The omens do not look good, and there are complex issues at work. But Christianity is growing, not dying. The future may certainly be in sub-Saharan Africa, South America, and the great unknown of China. Islam has not yet had to face, as Christianity has done, the inner reformation that always occurs in religious communities at times of shift. But there are signs of hope. And I end with Pope Francis' words to my own Melkite church. In this difficult period, many Christian communities in the Middle East are called to live their faith in the Lord Jesus amid many trials. I ardently hope that with their living witness, bishops, priests and people will be encouraging each other to remain in the land of birth that divine providence desired for them. I recalled that in this difficult time, shepherds are called to manifest communion, unity, closeness, solidarity and transparency before the suffering people of God. I ask you fraternally and invite you to continue this path. I'm grateful, very grateful, for those in the churches I've served who have been the little ones that have shown me the way. And I hope in my own way I might be a very small one to help others find direction too. Thank you.